The broken TNT satchel hung from Jake McNiece's shoulder like a prayer answered by the wrong god. Dawn fog clung to the Normandy hedgerows, muffling the distant rumble of German armor moving toward the stone bridge at Carentan. 3 hours since the scattered drop, and half his demolition gear lay buried under a collapsed barn roof while Wehrmacht voices drifted closer through the grey morning air. McNiece crouched behind a thorn bush, examining the frayed detonation cord that should have been his lifeline to 20 pounds of high explosive. Shrapnel had severed it clean, leaving him with maybe 3 feet of usable fuse and a bridge that needed to disappear before panzer tanks turned it into a highway toward Allied positions. The medieval stonework had stood for 3 centuries. It would take more than hope and electrical tape to bring it down. Private Tommy Garrison pressed a field dressing against the gash on his forearm, his voice carrying the flat acceptance of paratroopers who'd learned to expect miracles from broken equipment. "Mac, that cord's shot to hell. We got maybe enough fuse to light a cigarette." Behind them, Corporals Charles Plowder and Jack Agnew kept watch through gaps in the hedgerow, their rifles trained on the approach road where German reconnaissance had appeared 20 minutes earlier. The bridge's center span hung 40 feet above the canal, supported by stone archways that had weathered wars before this one. Standard procedure called for shaped charges against the support columns, timed detonations that would drop the roadway cleanly into dark water. But standard procedure assumed functional equipment and adequate time, luxuries that had disappeared somewhere over the channel during their chaotic night jump. McNiece stripped wire from his radio pack, splicing it with fishing line from his emergency kit, while German voices grew louder in the distance. The makeshift connection looked like something a child might build from spare parts, unreliable and dangerous. "We could fall back," Garrison suggested, watching McNiece work the primer into an improvised housing. "Regroup with Baker Company, come back with proper gear." It was reasonable advice from a reasonable soldier, the kind of tactical thinking that kept men alive and missions incomplete. McNiece knew better. By the time they reached Baker Company and requisitioned new explosives, German armor would be rolling across intact stone toward American positions. The bridge would stand, the road would remain open, and paratroopers would die because he chose safety over improvisation. The damaged primer cord forced him to calculate blast patterns with desperate precision. Instead of careful positioning that would guarantee clean collapse, he'd have to rely on concentrated force against the weakest structural point, a hairline crack where winter frost had worked into the mortar. McNiece wedged the TNT block into the fissure, packing loose stone around it for directional force. His hands trembled as he strung the wire and tape fuse across 40 yards of open ground to a depression behind the bridge approach. The improvised connection might carry flame long enough to trigger detonation, or it might leave them crouched in a crater with Germans shooting down at them. But desperation defined the difference between paratroopers and ordinary infantry, the willingness to attempt impossible solutions when conventional methods failed. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The German patrol emerged from the hedgerows like grey ghosts materializing from Normandy fog. 6 soldiers, moving with the confidence of men who owned the countryside, their weapons casually ready but not yet aimed. They approached the bridge in tactical formation, checking both sides of the roadway for signs of sabotage or ambush, while McNiece counted heartbeats behind his makeshift firing position. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through the radio static, tinged with the exhaustion of an officer who'd been managing impossible situations since midnight. "Dog Company reports panzer movement 2 miles east. You've got maybe 20 minutes before they reach your position. 20 minutes to blow a bridge with damaged equipment or watch German armor roll towards scattered American positions." McNiece examined his improvised detonator, a salvaged component from a broken radio that might spark or might simply click uselessly when he needed it most. The TNT block waited beneath enemy boots like a buried promise, connected to hope by electrical tape and fishing line. Garrison crouched beside him, pressing fresh bandage against his wounded arm, while studying the German soldiers with professional interest. "They're checking for mines, Mac. Standard sweep pattern. They'll spot your charges if they look close enough." The bridge's stone felt ancient under McNiece's palms, worn smooth by centuries of weather, but still strong enough to bear tank weight. He'd placed the TNT against a structural weakness that might respond to concentrated force, or might absorb 20 pounds of explosive without significant damage. Improvised demolition was equal parts physics and prayer, with lives hanging on calculations made under pressure. Behind them, Plowder signaled movement in the distant hedgerows. More German soldiers, possibly an advance element for heavier vehicles. The tactical situation was collapsing faster than McNiece could adapt his makeshift plan. If he waited much longer, the bridge would be too heavily defended to approach. If he detonated too early, he might miss the patrol and leave the structure intact. "Jesus, Mac," Agnew whispered from his observation post. "How'd you know this would work?" It was a fair question from a man watching improvised materials accomplish what proper equipment might achieve. McNiece didn't mention the cold mathematics of explosive force or his instinctive understanding of structural weak points. The damaged TNT block looked unreliable in the morning light, a jury-rigged solution that violated every principle of careful demolition work. Morrison's voice returned through radio static, carrying news that changed everything. "Baker Company's pinned down near the causeway. No relief coming your way. Whatever you're planning, make it count." McNiece felt the weight of decision settling across his shoulders like wet canvas. The German soldiers paused at the bridge's center span, their leader pointing toward movement in distant hedgerows. They'd spotted American positions and had perhaps 30 seconds before automatic weapons fire turned the canal bank into a killing field. His finger found the detonator switch, while enemy voices rose in sudden urgency above the morning fog. The choice crystallized in that moment between breath and action. Follow doctrine and lose everything, or trust improvised equipment and damage pride to save scattered paratroopers who depended on one demolition to hold back tanks. McNiece pressed his face into mud that tasted of cordite and terror, counting heartbeats while his thumb hovered over a switch that might work. The switch clicked with surprising authority. Flame raced along McNiece's spliced primer cord, carrying destruction toward 20 pounds of military explosive packed against medieval stone. He pressed deeper into the muddy depression, counting seconds while German voices rose in confusion above him. The blast arrived like thunder, breaking directly overhead, a crushing wave of sound and pressure that lifted grown men off their feet and dropped them into sudden silence. When McNiece raised his head, the bridge center span hung at a twisted angle above churning water. Stone blocks the size of automobiles lay scattered across the canal bottom, creating a barrier that no vehicle could cross. The German patrol had vanished into the debris field, their confident voices replaced by the gentle splash of disturbed water finding its level. Garrison stared at the destruction with something approaching awe. "Jesus, Mac. How'd you know that would work?" McNiece didn't answer immediately. He lit a cigarette with hands that barely trembled, studying the gap where a bridge had stood moments before. The damaged TNT block, pronounced useless by conventional wisdom, had accomplished exactly what proper equipment might have achieved. But the mathematics of explosive force felt less important than the weight settling in his chest. The knowledge that 6 men had disappeared into rubble because he'd chosen action over hesitation. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with relief and urgency. "Nice work, McNiece. Now get your men back to the rally point before Jerry sends more patrols your way." They moved through the hedgerows like ghosts, leaving behind scattered stone and dark water where German armor would have crossed toward American positions. Behind them, the Normandy countryside stretched toward distant artillery flashes, marked by roads that no longer connected to bridges. McNiece carried his empty TNT satchel and the memory of flame racing along improvised fuse toward an explosion that had solved one problem while creating others he couldn't yet name. At the company command post, Captain Richard studied after-action reports with the methodical attention of an officer who understood that successful missions generated their own complications. Division wants details on your demolition technique, McNiece. Apparently, someone's impressed with how you brought down that bridge with minimal charges. The official language bothered him more than enemy fire. Minimal charges and demolition technique suggested careful planning rather than desperate improvisation with damaged equipment. McNiece had rigged 20 pounds of TNT against structural weakness and prayed that physics would cooperate. The results looked impressive on paper, but the memory felt heavier than the empty satchel hanging from his shoulder. Plowder approached with coffee and quiet concern. "You all right, Mac? You've been staring at that map for 20 minutes. The map showed roads and bridges across the Normandy bocage, each marked with tactical symbols that reduced complex terrain to simple lines. McNiece's bridge appeared as a red X, objective achieved, route denied to enemy armor. But the symbol couldn't capture the weight of decision or the faces of German soldiers who'd been checking for mines when his improvised charges detonated beneath their boots. "Sometimes trouble's just another word for getting things done," he said finally, shouldering his pack for the walk toward whatever bridge or road needed destroying next. "Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." 3 weeks later, near a Dutch canal outside Nijmegen, McNiece found himself staring at another bridge through September rain. Operation Market Garden had scattered the 506th across flooded polders and narrow causeways where German resistance proved stronger than intelligence reports suggested. The steel span ahead carried a road that division needed intact, but Wehrmacht engineers were rigging demolition charges of their own. The tactical problem felt familiar. Too little time, inadequate equipment, and orders that assumed conditions on the ground would match plans drawn up miles away. McNiece crouched behind a damaged farmhouse with his remaining demolition gear. 2 TNT blocks, enough detonation cord for one attempt, and a growing reputation for accomplishing impossible things under pressure. Lieutenant Morrison studied the bridge through field glasses, his voice tight with the strain of managing scattered platoons across unfamiliar terrain. "Intelligence says Jerry's got charges placed on the center supports. If they blow it before we can cross, 2nd Battalion's cut off on the wrong side of that canal." The German position looked professionally prepared. Machine gun nests covering the approaches, riflemen in buildings overlooking the span, and engineers working methodically to complete their demolition setup. McNiece counted enemy soldiers and calculated angles of approach, searching for weakness in defenses that seemed designed to prevent exactly what he needed to accomplish. Sergeant Mike Marquez emerged from the farmhouse with grim news from other sectors. "Baker companies taking casualties near the main road. Dog companies pinned down short of their objective. Whatever we do here, we're doing it alone." The weight of isolation pressed against McNiece's chest like wet canvas. Market Garden was supposed to punch a corridor through German defenses, but the reality felt more like scattered actions by undersupplied units trying to hold ground that intelligence hadn't properly mapped. His damaged TNT satchel from Normandy had been replaced, but the feeling of improvising with inadequate resources remained constant. Morrison lowered his field glasses with the expression of an officer facing impossible choices. "McNiece, I need those German charges neutralized and that bridge kept intact. Can you do it without bringing the whole span down?" It was the kind of question that assumed precision under conditions that demanded improvisation. McNiece would have to approach German positions, locate their demolition setup, and disable charges without triggering an explosion that would accomplish enemy objectives. The tactical challenge felt like defusing a bomb while people shot at him. Technically possible, practically suicidal. "Give me 20 minutes, he said, checking his gear with the methodical attention of a man who understood that small mistakes produced large consequences. The approach to the bridge lay across open ground swept by machine gun fire, with minimal cover except for scattered rubble and abandoned equipment. McNiece moved in short rushes between concealment, carrying his TNT blocks and the growing certainty that this mission would require more improvisation than training had ever contemplated. Behind him, Morrison coordinated covering fire while German bullets sparked off steel and stone. The enemy demolition charges were positioned exactly where doctrine suggested, against the bridge's main supports, with enough explosive to drop the span cleanly into dark water. McNiece found the German setup professionally rigged and carefully timed, the work of engineers who understood both demolition and defensive tactics. Disabling their charges without triggering sympathetic detonation would require precise work under conditions that made precision nearly impossible. McNiece's hands moved with mechanical precision, while machine gun bullets sparked off bridge steel above his head. The German demolition charges were wired in series, elegant, professional work that would drop the span in synchronized sequence if he triggered the wrong connection. But 20 years later, sitting in an Oklahoma diner with coffee growing cold, he would remember something else entirely: the moment when his damaged nerves almost cost American lives. The official citation would mention exceptional courage under fire and successful neutralization of enemy demolitions. It wouldn't describe how his hands shook uncontrollably for 30 seconds while German voices grew louder on the far side of the bridge. The tremor started in his fingers and spread through his wrists, making precise wirework impossible exactly when precision mattered most. Private Kowalski provided covering fire from a position behind shattered concrete, his rifle cracking steadily, while McNiece fought against paralysis that had nothing to do with enemy bullets. The shaking felt like electricity running through damaged circuits, a reminder of the Normandy Bridge and the weight of decisions made with inadequate information. He pressed his palms against cold steel until the tremor subsided, then returned to the delicate work of disarming charges designed to kill him. The German timer showed 4 minutes remaining when McNiece located the main firing circuit. Professional demolition required cutting specific wires in proper sequence, but his damaged nerves and enemy fire made textbook procedure impossible. Instead, he wedged his own TNT blocks against the German charges, creating a crude but effective jamming device that would disrupt their carefully planned detonation. Morrison's voice carried across the bridge approach through radio static and rifle fire. 2 minutes, McNiece. German reinforcements moving up the east bank. The tactical situation was collapsing faster than he could work. McNiece stripped wire from the enemy setup and spliced it into his own detonation system, creating an improvised circuit that might disable German charges or might trigger a catastrophic explosion. The mathematics of sympathetic detonation suggested his plan would either work perfectly or kill everyone within 100 yards. With 30 seconds remaining on the German timer, McNiece made the choice that would echo through decades of nightmares. He yanked the main firing wire and pressed his own detonator simultaneously. The explosion that followed was smaller than catastrophic, larger than controlled, exactly the kind of calculated risk that made him valuable and unemployable in equal measure. When the smoke cleared, the bridge stood intact but damaged, passable for infantry but questionable for heavy vehicles. The German charges had been neutralized through brute force rather than finesse, and Wehrmacht engineers on the far side were retreating toward defensive positions. McNiece gathered his equipment with hands that trembled again, this time from adrenaline rather than damaged nerves. Years later, when people asked about his techniques, McNiece would describe careful planning and professional execution. He never mentioned the 30 seconds when his hands wouldn't obey his will, or the moments when he nearly triggered German charges through pure mechanical failure. The citation mentioned courage, But courage felt less relevant than the stubborn refusal to admit that some jobs were beyond his capability. Morrison found him sitting against the bridge abutment, smoking a cigarette while studying the intact span with something between satisfaction and exhaustion. "Division's calling it a textbook operation, Mac. They want you to brief other demolition teams on your methods." McNiece knew better than to explain that his methods included mechanical failure, improvised solutions, and decisions made when conventional options had been exhausted. The bridge stood because he'd been too stubborn to admit defeat and too damaged to follow proper procedure. In official reports, that combination would be described as exceptional performance under pressure. The after-action report reduced the Dutch bridge operation to 3 paragraphs of tactical language, describing successful neutralization of enemy demolitions and preservation of vital crossing point. Captain Richards filed the paperwork with the methodical attention of an officer who understood that successful missions required documentation, regardless of how they actually unfolded. McNiece sat outside the command post, cleaning his gear while September rain drummed against canvas overhead. The intact bridge carried 2nd Battalion across the canal toward objectives that intelligence maps suggested would be lightly defended. His damaged TNT satchel hung empty beside him, waiting for the next mission that would require improvised solutions to impossible problems. Sergeant Marquez approached with coffee and quiet observation. "You know they're putting you in for another commendation, Mac. Morrison thinks Division might want you for instructor duty back in the States." The possibility of teaching demolition techniques to fresh recruits felt worse than enemy fire. McNiece couldn't imagine explaining his methods to young soldiers who deserved better than lessons in mechanical failure and desperate improvisation. His hands worked steadily cleaning equipment while his mind catalogued the growing weight of bridges blown and preserved, roads opened and denied, decisions made when conventional wisdom had been exhausted. Lieutenant Morrison emerged from the command post with new orders and familiar complications. 3rd Battalion needs support at the Arnhem Road junction. Intelligence reports German armor moving up from the south. "Think you can handle one more bridge, McNiece?" It was the kind of question that assumed infinite capability and renewable courage. McNiece shouldered his empty TNT satchel, checking equipment with automatic precision while calculating the mathematics of explosive force and human endurance. Each mission added weight to memories that official citations couldn't capture or reduce to tactical language. The walk toward Arnhem carried them through flooded polders where Market Garden's ambitious timeline had collapsed into scattered actions by undersupplied units. Behind them, the intact Dutch bridge carried American infantry toward objectives that might or might not exist, as intelligence described. McNiece's improvised demolition work had preserved one crossing while preparing for the next destruction. 40 years later, a freight train crossing a steel bridge in Oklahoma would bring it all back, the weight of decisions made with inadequate information, the tremor in his hands when precision mattered most, and the gap between official citations and actual memories. McNiece would pull his truck to the roadside, waiting for the sound of wheels on steel to fade into distance. The official history of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment would describe his actions in 3 wars and multiple campaigns, reducing complex operations to tactical summaries and commendation language. But the real weight would remain in Oklahoma diners and quiet moments when mechanical sounds triggered memories of bridges blown and preserved, roads opened and denied, and the stubborn refusal to admit that some jobs were beyond human capability. In the end, the legend would prove lighter than the memories, carried by men who understood that behind every medal and mission report lived a human being wrestling with decisions made when conventional solutions had been exhausted. The bridges stood or fell according to physics and improvisation, but the cost remained with those who carried the weight of impossible choices long after the last reports were filed and the citations awarded. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.